All right, today we're going to look further at the central nervous system. We've already talked about the central nervous system a bit. We know it's made up of the brain and spinal cord, and it's an integrative kind of control center for the nervous system. Well, the central nervous system is also comparable to a switchboard, that of a telephone system, because it's able to interconnect many different signals. It receives a vast number of incoming calls or sensory inputs, and then it's able to send out motor outputs or responses to those calls using the peripheral nervous system. But just consisting of two structures, the brain and spinal cord, it's able to process all of this incoming sensory information. So we know that the brain and spinal cord, that's the central nervous system. But what we haven't talked about is that cephalization has occurred in the human brain, which is the elaboration of growth of the anterior portion of the central nervous system, so primarily the cerebrum. And that's because we've seen an increase in the number of neurons in the head, so that mass where we store most of those neurons in the adult brain has increased in size. And the highest level currently of cephalization is seen in the human brain. We see that in embryonic development, though, the brain starts out pretty simple. Even the spinal cord, they both together start out as just this neural tube. But as that neural tube develops, it will give rise to primary and secondary brain vesicles, or areas. The three primary brain vesicles are the proencephalon, the forebrain, mesencephalon, the midbrain, and the rhombencephalon, or hindbrain. Here we can see those primary brain vesicles highlighted, and you can see that the primary brain vesicles give rise to the secondary brain vesicles, and the secondary brain vesicles give rise to adult brain structures. We're going to focus mainly on the adult brain structures like the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. And even though we're focusing mainly on the brain first, we can't forget the spinal cord, which is also a part of the central nervous system. Both the brain and spinal cord are connected by internal regions or spaces, oftentimes called canal regions. Those canal regions in the brain are called ventricles or aqueducts, and they're oftentimes the canal or central canal in the spinal cord. So let's further look at the development of the brain. And we've talked about cephalization now, so it should make more sense now that as the brain grows, since it's still in a skull that's not growing but is trying to contain it, the developing biggest mass of the brain, the cerebral hemispheres, those have had to crease and fold into convolutions. We call the ridges of these convolutions gyri, and the valleys, or the kind of grooves in between, sulci. This will create very convoluted cerebral hemispheres. We have both a left and right, separated by a longitudinal fissure. The growth of the cerebral hemispheres tends to be towards the back or growth posteriorly, and also growth laterally or to the sides. And then at birth, the brain would already contain or have gone through the development enough to contain the four main structures, including the cerebrum, or the cerebral hemispheres with their numerous convolutions, the diencephalon with its thalamus, epithalamus, and hypothalamus, the brainstem with its midbrain, pons, and medulla, and the cerebellum. So let's go through those again. You have the two cerebral hemispheres. Here in the image, we can only see a left cerebral hemisphere, but there would be a right cerebral hemisphere. This is the structure we've been talking about developing to the extent that it has many grooves or convolutions. So it has ridges and valleys, and we'll look more at that structure. We also have the diencephalon, which here looks kind of like a purple deflated balloon. It consists of the thalamus, which is a relay station for the brain, the hypothalamus, which controls the autonomic nervous system and functions mainly in homeostasis, and also the epithalamus, which contains the pineal gland, which secretes melatonin, which regulates sleep and wake cycles. You also have the brainstem with its midbrain, pons, and medulla. Many of these structures, especially the pons, are conducting pathways between higher processing areas of the brain and the spinal cord and the rest of the body. Areas like the medulla in the brainstem, which are going to be adjacent to the spinal cord, they contain areas that are really important for things like cardiovascular functioning, such as the heart beating, whether it increases or slows down, but they also contain respiratory centers, which are going to regulate breathing rate and breathing depth. And then you have the cerebellum, and the cerebellum, unlike the brainstem in green, sits just under the occipital lobe and is not necessarily connected as close as the brainstem to the spinal cord, but is nearby. This little brain or cerebellum is going to be responsible for subconscious activity, and so it's really going to help kind of fine-tune motor blueprints, especially those that we're familiar with or have become a habit. So here's a better picture. We have two cerebral hemispheres. That makes up the cerebrum. That's the first adult brain region. We have the diencephalon, made up of three structures: the thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. The cerebellum, also known as the little brain, and the brainstem, made up of the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Alright, so that's our basics for the brain. We're going to go much more in detail, but make sure you come and watch the other videos to see that detail.